It's been a busy month for Indian diplomacy. We had the G20 ministers meeting last week. The Italian Prime Minister was in town. This week, the Australian Prime Minister is going to be in New Delhi as well as in Ahmedabad as India seeks to make a stellar contribution in the year of its G20 presidency. But of course, there are global headwinds. There is the Russia-Ukraine war, which has divided the nations, with the United States and its European partners on the one side, firmly entrenched in their position on Ukraine, and then you have Russia and China in the other corner. Can India walk this diplomatic tightrope? Joining me now is a very, very special guest. Tony Abbott is the former Prime Minister of Australia, currently on a tour here in India. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Abbott, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. I want to first start off by asking you about the free trade agreement between India and Australia. You had played an important role in the run-up to the signing that happened last year. How do you see the ECTA working so far? What more, in your view, can be done to expand trade between India and Australia? In fact, before the ECTA came into effect, trade was just a bit over $23 billion, which many would say is underwhelming. How do you see that increasing going forward?
I wouldn't want to minimise what's already been agreed. The deal that was finalised at the end of last year will allow 100% of Indian exports into Australia without tariffs or quotas within 6 years, and will allow 90% of Australian exports to India in without tariffs and quotas within 6 years. So the deal that's already been done, while it's expressed to be an interim agreement, is in fact a very, very good agreement. It's the best deal India's done with any major economy, and it's the first deal India's done with anyone in 10 years. So it's a good deal, and I would hate to think that people would hold back waiting for the icing to be put on the cake rather than making the most of the cake they've already got. Now, that said, you can always improve things. There's still 10% of Australian products that will be tariffed in 6 years' time. Obviously, there's a lot more that we might be able to do down the track in terms of further recognising Indian credentials and qualifications. There's a lot that we can do in terms of making sure our economies are digitally integrated.
Correct.
But nevertheless, it is much, much easier for Indians to do business in Australia and for Australians to do business in India now than it ever has been in the past.
Now, one area of cooperation has been vis-a-vis mitigating climate change. India has, of course, set a target of 2070 for net zero carbon emissions. Australia has a similar goal. How do you see cooperation between India and Australia on climate change, particularly some of the newer technology that folks are talking about, like green hydrogen? How feasible do you think it is?
Look, green hydrogen is the holy grail. Because if we are able to use wind and solar power to economically create green hydrogen, it would certainly turn intermittent power into reliable power. But I think there's a long way to go before that technology is proven at scale. In the medium term, I think that it's wonderful that clean Australian coal is now entering India tariff-free, including coal from the Adani mine in central Queensland. I think that it's good that Australian scientists and technicians are working together to try to ensure that we do improve our green technologies. But the important thing in the end is not just to get emissions down, it's to keep the lights on in countries like Australia and to get the lights on in countries like India. And that's why I think the Adani mine was so important and why I backed it so strongly, because there are still tens of millions of people in India that lack access to 24/7 power, and this is helping to give it to them. Now, things have improved immensely over the last decade or so, thanks to the Modi government.
Yeah.
But India is going to need Australian coal, Australian gas, for quite some time. The world is going to need fossil fuels for quite some time. And yes, by all means, let's get emissions down as far and as fast as we can. But let's not do it in ways that really damage people's standard of living, particularly in countries like India that still have hundreds of millions of people not really living the kind of prosperous, secure existence that we'd like them to have.
It's going to be a busy week for diplomacy between Canberra and Delhi. This week, the new Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is going to be here in India. He's going to be in Delhi as well as in Ahmedabad. Australia and India are both members of the Quad. How do you see this grouping shaping up so far, including the Quad foreign ministers meeting that we had last week?
I think that relations between Australia and India have never been stronger. The fact that we have done the trade deal is great. The fact that we are both part of the Quad is great. The fact that we've had a cavalcade of Australian ministers come to Delhi over the last little while, the Education Minister, the Trade Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Resources Minister, and now the Prime Minister, that's great. I think it's fantastic that Narendra Modi is going to be in Australia for the Quad meeting later in the year. And I think that Narendra Modi is playing a remarkable part on the world stage, and this is only going to increase thanks to the G20. When you look at the Quad, the most significant geopolitical development since NATO, the architects of the Quad were Shinzo Abe from Japan and Narendra Modi from India. Without Abe's initiation and without Modi's generous response, I don't think the Quad would have happened. I don't think it was something that a US president could have done. Certainly it's not something that an Australian Prime Minister could have done. But between them, Abe and Modi did it. And yes, I suppose Xi Jinping had a hand in it by being so belligerent. But nevertheless, Modi is a very, very consequential world statesman thanks to his work with the Quad.
So the Quad foreign ministers, like I said, met on the sidelines of the G20 here in Delhi last week. They once again reiterated they're not a military grouping. They're not meant to counter any one country, leave alone China. Can there be a bigger threat than China? Quad now increasingly seems to be diversifying into all kinds of things, from climate change to student scholarships and science and technology partnerships. Does that not dilute the very purpose that these four countries came together for, which was to take on the Chinese threat on the high seas, whether it is these territorial disputes in the South and East China Seas, or just ensuring that there are free and open trading lanes on the high seas?
Well, that's a very fair question. I guess the four countries in question are serious strategic actors. The United States is the world's #1 democratic superpower. India is the world's #2 democratic superpower. Japan is an economic powerhouse and increasingly a military one as well. And Australia is a very significant part of the Indo-Pacific as well. So what you've got is the four big democracies of the Indo-Pacific working together to try to ensure that democracy can flourish and a rules-based global order can survive under the various challenges. Now, sure, there are all sorts of other things that can be done. The recent Quad meeting talked a bit about terrorism and what we could do to help in that area, help each other in that area. Great, but in the end, this is about the great Indo-Pacific democracies saying to anyone who would challenge the rules-based global order, don't. And we obviously know that Beijing is casting covetous eyes towards Taiwan, that Beijing would take Taiwan by force if it could. We've got to say to Beijing, look, don't. And the Quad raises doubts in Beijing's mind about just who it would be up against if it were to embark on this shocking act of adventurism. And let's be very clear, any attack on Taiwan would be several orders of magnitude more disruptive to the entire world than Putin's horrific attack on Ukraine.
You talked about the attack on Ukraine, and that's one issue that has now deeply divided the world between the West and the East, the North and the South. We saw just this past week how this issue was the singular stumbling block in the G20 countries not being able to adopt a joint communique. Are we increasingly seeing a world in which the United States and its European partners, other allies, are in the one corner, firmly backing Ukraine, and then you have Russia and China, two big powers, in the other corner, and countries that are seemingly neutral are stuck between these two sort of alliances, or between a rock and a hard place, if you will?
We all very much hoped after the fall of the Berlin Wall back in 1989 that we were entering a sunlit upland of peace and freedom based on an all but universal acceptance of liberal democracy and market capitalism. What we underestimated was the fact that Russia and China are aggressive revisionist powers. They have been nursing resentments and brooding, and at least in China's case, they've been building up their strength. The military build-up of China over the last couple of decades is the fastest and largest in peacetime history. So I guess the Ukraine war is a reminder that history didn't end in 1989, that war between nation states is still possible. In a sense, it's even more horrific than ever, as we are seeing, and it could get a lot worse in Ukraine if Putin escalates to de-escalate, as it were. And that means it's very, very important that we say to other potential aggressors, don't, because you won't win. The cost of you doing this is too high. I think there's no doubt that if Putin thought the attack on Ukraine would be as difficult as it turned out to be, that the Russian military would be as humiliated as they often have, he wouldn't have done it. If Ukraine had been a member of NATO, I don't believe this would have happened. It was only because Putin judged that Ukraine was largely friendless that he thought he could get away with his aggression, and I think it's critical that other potential aggressors do not get tempted by weakness.
So, in that context, do you believe that India, by virtue of being the host of the G20 this year, but also because it's one of the few countries which has good relations both with America and with Russia, do you think India will be able to play the role of a mediator in this conflict?
Well, India is a very substantial country, there's no doubt about that, and I thought it was very significant when Narendra Modi made a pretty clear point to Putin when they met last year that there was no place for war at this time. And it was also significant that the Quad foreign ministers did take a stand against Russia and its aggression in Ukraine, and that includes India's Jaishankar. So I think India is, in a non-provocative way, taking a appropriately strong position. I can understand that because of the history with the old Soviet Union and because of the fact that there are still a lot of armament in the Indian arsenal that's Soviet supplied or Russian supplied, that there are certain realpolitik factors at work here, just as Israel, as it happens, has not really condemned Putin's aggression because it needs to have a relationship with the Russians in Syria. So I think that we've got to be realistic and understanding that when it comes to the rhetoric, there's only so much that India can do. But I haven't met a single Indian of any substance who is not appalled by what's going on. And I think there's, as was shown in the Raisina dialogue just recently, when the Russian foreign minister made a typically blustering and mendacious speech, he was greeted with universal and obvious derision by the audience.
Last couple of questions. There have been a slew of incidents recently in Australia of Hindu temples being vandalized, graffiti being sprayed on their walls and so on. And the Australian government has not been seen, at least, as taking swift action. What will you say, Prime Minister, to assuage concerns here that some folks in India may have on these incidents?
I haven't been briefed on these particular issues, I can certainly understand why India would be anxious about any Australian-sourced agitation, separatist agitation. My understanding is that the recent protest in Melbourne was not nearly as big as it was reported to have been, and it was basically initiated by people who had come into Australia on tourist visas, pretending to want a holiday, but in fact dead set on agitation. Now, we do have ways of trying to ensure that that doesn't happen in the future. It's not for me to speak on behalf of the current government, but I'd be amazed if, knowing India's understandable concerns, we did red flag these activists from overseas and made sure that if they came into the country, it wasn't for the purpose of anti-Indian agitation.
All right, and I'll have to round off with a question on cricket, not least because of the ongoing India-Australia series, which seems to be nicely poised at 2-1. Would you wager a bet on who would win the Border Gavaskar Trophy?
I think, like all Australians, I enjoyed the third test better than the first and the second, and let's hope both the Prime Minister and Prime Ministers Modi and Albanese have something to cheer in the fourth test, and I'm sure whichever way it goes, cricket will be the winner.
All right. Thank you very much, Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia. Thank you very much indeed for your insights, your perspective into some of the pressing global issues right now, and of course, where the current state of relationship is between Canberra and Delhi, and of course, rounding off with his thoughts on the ongoing cricket series. That's a wrap. Thanks very much for tuning in. Good night.